There was a time when the proudest officers of the German Wehrmacht stood in the muddy trenches of the Western Front, binoculars pressed against their eyes, watching the American forces assemble across no man's land with expressions of barely concealed contempt. These were men who had survived the brutal Eastern Front, who had witnessed the devastating power of Soviet Katyusha rockets, who had orchestrated lightning strikes across Poland and France with surgical precision. They had seen the face of modern warfare, or so they believed. When intelligence reports began flooding in about American artillery preparations in the autumn of 1944, many of these seasoned commanders dismissed the threat with the kind of arrogance that only comes from years of victory. They had watched the Americans fumble through North Africa, struggle in Italy, and now here they were again, these soldiers from across the Atlantic who seemed more interested in chewing gum and reading comic books than understanding the sophisticated art of European warfare. The German officers laughed in their command bunkers, shared cigarettes, and told each other that American firepower was nothing but propaganda, that their industrial capacity meant nothing without the warrior spirit that had been forged in the crucible of real battle. They believed their fortified positions in the Huichin forest and along the Siegfried Line were impenetrable, that their experience and tactical brilliance would easily overwhelm these newcomers to the European theater. But what these officers could not see, what they could not comprehend in their moment of supreme confidence, was that they were about to witness something that would redefine the very concept of artillery warfare. They were about to learn that when American industrial might combined with methodical planning and overwhelming firepower, entire landscapes could be erased from existence. This is the story of how Mockery turned to terror, how forests that had stood for centuries vanished in hours, and how the thunder of American guns became the sound that haunted German soldiers for the rest of their lives. Understanding why German officers held such dismissive attitudes toward American military capabilities requires examining the deep roots of Prussian military tradition that had shaped German warfare for generations. The German officer corps was not simply a military organization, but a cultural institution that traced its lineage back to Frederick the Great and the methodical, almost scientific approach to warfare that had made Prussia a dominant European power. These men were educated in military academies where they studied Clausewitz and Moltke with the same reverence that priests studied scripture. They learned to see warfare as an art form that required not just courage but intellectual sophistication, careful planning, and an understanding of terrain, logistics, and human psychology that took years to develop. By the time World War II erupted across Europe, German officers had refined their doctrine of blitzkrieg into something that seemed almost unstoppable, combining air power, armor, and infantry in coordinated strikes that had brought France to its knees in weeks and pushed deep into the Soviet Union. The early victories created a sense of invincibility within the officer corps, a belief that German military science was simply superior to anything the Allies could produce. When they looked at American forces, they saw soldiers who came from a nation with no real military tradition, a country that had been isolationist for decades and whose army had been tiny before the war. The Americans seemed to lack the discipline and hardness that characterized German troops, and their command structure appeared amateurish compared to the sophisticated staff system that German officers had perfected over centuries. German intelligence reports often focused on American material wealth while dismissing their tactical capabilities, noting that American soldiers received better food and more comfortable conditions, but seemed to lack the fanatical determination that drove German troops forward even in desperate situations. This cultural prejudice was reinforced by early encounters in North Africa, where American forces under inexperienced leadership had suffered embarrassing defeats at places like Kasserine Pass, giving German commanders like Rommel further reason to believe that Americans could be easily handled once they became accustomed to their tactics. What the German officers failed to understand What their intelligence services could not fully grasp despite mountains of reports was the absolutely staggering scale of American industrial mobilization that had been unleashed after Pearl Harbor. The United States had transformed itself from a nation still recovering from the Great Depression into the greatest military production machine the world had ever seen in a span of less than 3 years. Factories that had once produced automobiles were now churning out tanks at rates that seemed impossible to European observers. Shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. Aircraft production had reached levels where American planes were becoming expendable assets rather than precious resources to be carefully husbanded. But perhaps nowhere was this industrial might more evident than in artillery production. American factories were producing howitzers, field guns, and ammunition at a pace that defied imagination. The standard American field artillery piece, the M2 105 howitzer, was being manufactured by the thousands. Larger guns like the 155 Long Tom and the massive 240 howitzers were rolling off assembly lines in numbers that would have seemed like fantasy to military planners just years before. More importantly, American industry had solved the ammunition problem that plagued every other army in the war. While German forces were increasingly forced to ration artillery shells due to resource shortages and Allied bombing of their production facilities, American units were receiving ammunition supplies that seemed limitless. Train after train arrived at forward supply dumps carrying shells by the hundreds of thousands. Logistics officers who had trained in peacetime to carefully manage limited resources now found themselves managing an embarrassment of riches, where the challenge was not finding enough shells, but finding enough trucks to move them all forward. The American military had also embraced standardization and mass production in ways that European armies had not, creating supply systems that could keep vast numbers of guns fed with ammunition, even during rapid advances. Artillery battalions were organized with careful attention to coordination and fire control, with radio communications and forward observers working together to bring down concentrated fire with unprecedented speed and accuracy. The doctrine that emerged was simple but devastating in its application. When American forces encountered resistance, they did not attempt to maneuver around it through clever tactics, but instead called down such overwhelming firepower that the enemy position simply ceased to exist. By the autumn of 1944, the situation on the Western Front had reached a critical juncture that would set the stage for the demonstrations of firepower that would shock the German military establishment. The euphoria of the rapid advance across France after the Normandy breakout had begun to slow as Allied forces approached the German border and encountered the prepared defenses of the Siegfried Line. The Germans had used the brief respite to rush reinforcements westward, pulling battered divisions from other fronts and scraping together whatever forces they could to defend the sacred soil of the fatherland. The terrain itself favored the defenders, with dense forests like the Huichen providing natural fortifications that German engineers had enhanced with bunkers, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire. German commanders felt confident that they could bleed the Americans white in this terrain, forcing them into costly frontal assaults that would drain their manpower and break their will to continue the offensive. Intelligence reports reaching German headquarters showed massive American artillery concentrations building up behind the front lines, but veteran officers dismissed these as defensive preparations or perhaps attempts at intimidation. They had seen large artillery parks before on the Eastern Front, and while they respected the danger, they did not believe American gunners possessed the skill or determination to use these weapons with devastating effect. The German defensive philosophy relied heavily on dispersed positions, hardened bunkers, and the natural cover provided by the thick forests that dominated much of the border region. Officers calculated that even if the Americans did launch heavy bombardments, their troops could shelter in deep bunkers and emerge to man their weapons once the shelling stopped, the same tactic that had worked against Allied artillery throughout the war. What these calculations failed to account for was the sheer scale and duration of fire that American forces were prepared to deliver. Firepower that would not stop after a brief preparatory bombardment, but would continue for hours or even days, reshaping the landscape itself into something unrecognizable. The initial American artillery preparations that preceded major attacks in the fall of 1944 began to hint at what was coming. But even these massive bombardments did not fully reveal the devastating potential of concentrated American firepower. When the battle for Aachen began in October, American artillery units supporting the assault fired over 20,000 shells in a single day, a number that seemed astronomical to German defenders who were accustomed to carefully rationed artillery support. The old city that had been Charlemagne's capital, and a symbol of German imperial glory, was subjected to bombardments that reduced medieval buildings to rubble and filled the streets with debris. German officers observing from nearby positions noted the intensity of the fire, but remained confident that their defensive tactics would prevail once American infantry attempted to advance into the urban terrain where artillery would be less effective. They saw the bombardment as wasteful, a typical American approach of throwing resources at a problem rather than solving it through superior tactics and soldier quality. After each barrage lifted, German defenders emerged from their shelters and prepared to meet the infantry attacks, and while casualties were heavy, the defensive system remained intact enough to force Americans into costly house-to-house fighting. This seemed to confirm German prejudices about American methods, that they relied on material superiority but lacked the tactical finesse to achieve decisive victories without suffering disproportionate losses. What German observers failed to recognize was that Aachen represented merely a testing ground where American artillery doctrines were being refined and improved. Forward observers were learning to coordinate fire more effectively, communication systems were being streamlined, and ammunition supply procedures were being perfected. The artillery units themselves were gaining experience and confidence, learning to maintain high rates of fire for extended periods and to shift targets rapidly as tactical situations developed. Officers were carefully studying the results of different bombardment patterns, noting what worked and what could be improved. The massive fire support that had reduced Aachen to rubble was not the limit of American capabilities, but rather a preliminary exercise, a warm-up for what was to come when American forces pushed into the more heavily defended areas along the German border. The Huichen Forest presented American forces with one of the most challenging tactical situations they would face in the entire European campaign, a densely wooded area of 50 square miles where visibility was measured in yards, and where German defenders had prepared positions with meticulous care. The forest itself seemed almost primordial, with trees so thick that sunlight barely reached the forest floor even at midday, creating a perpetual twilight that favored defenders who knew the terrain. German troops had transformed this natural fortress into a killing ground with bunkers concealed among the trees, mines scattered along every trail and road, and pre-registered artillery targets covering every avenue of approach. When American divisions first pushed into the Huichen in September and October of 1944, they discovered that their normal tactical advantages meant little in this environment. Tanks and other armored vehicles were confined to the few roads, making them easy targets for German anti-tank guns. Air support was largely useless because pilots could not see through the forest canopy to identify targets. Even artillery, the great equalizer that American forces had come to rely upon, seemed less effective because shells burst in the treetops, their fragments absorbed by the thick vegetation rather than striking enemy positions. Initial attacks bogged down with horrifying casualties, as American infantry units were chewed apart by defenders they could barely see. German officers watching these failed assaults felt their confidence vindicated, believing that American firepower meant nothing in terrain where traditional infantry skills and defensive preparation mattered most. They radioed to higher headquarters that the Americans were being bled white, that their vaunted industrial might was useless in the face of determined defenders fighting in favorable terrain. But even as German commanders celebrated their tactical successes, American artillery officers were learning hard lessons and adapting their techniques to the forest environment. They began experimenting with different fuse settings and shell types, discovering that tree bursts could actually be turned to their advantage, because airburst shrapnel rained down on defenders who were dug in against direct fire. They increased the sheer volume of fire to compensate for the reduced effectiveness of individual shells, calculating that saturation bombardments would eventually destroy even well-protected positions through sheer overwhelming force. What emerged from the brutal fighting in places like the Huichin Forest was a uniquely American approach to artillery warfare that treated the problem not as an art form requiring tactical genius, but as an engineering challenge that could be solved through systematic application of firepower. American artillery officers, many of whom had engineering or business backgrounds in their civilian lives, approached fire planning with a methodical precision that seemed pedestrian compared to the more intuitive German approach, but proved devastatingly effective in practice. They divided target areas into grid squares and calculated exactly how many shells would be required to achieve desired levels of destruction for each type of terrain and fortification. They developed elaborate fire plans that could bring multiple artillery battalions to bear on single targets, coordinating their fire so that shells arrived simultaneously from different directions, making it impossible for defenders to find shelter. The communication systems that supported this approach were constantly being refined, with radio networks linking forward observers directly to fire direction centers where calculations could be performed rapidly and fire missions executed within minutes. What the Germans perceived as American lack of tactical sophistication was actually the implementation of a system that reduced warfare to equations and probabilities, eliminating the human element of judgment in favor of mathematical certainty. If intelligence indicated an enemy company was dug in at a particular location, American fire planners did not attempt to finesse the problem through clever positioning of guns or careful selection of ammunition types, but instead calculated how many tons of high explosive would be required to ensure nothing survived in that grid square, and then delivered that tonnage with industrial efficiency. The scale of ammunition expenditure that this doctrine required would have bankrupted any other army, but American logistics capabilities were such that shells were treated as nearly infinite resources. Artillery battalions were authorized to fire at rates that German officers would have considered criminally wasteful, and they were resupplied so quickly that they rarely faced ammunition shortages even during the most intensive operations. This fundamentally changed the calculus of defensive warfare, because German tactics relied on the assumption that even the wealthiest army could not sustain truly massive bombardments indefinitely. But American forces were proving that assumption catastrophically wrong. The transformation in German attitudes toward American artillery became starkly evident during the preparations for Operation Queen in November 1944, a large-scale offensive aimed at breaking through German lines and reaching the Roer River. American planners decided that this attack would be preceded by the largest artillery bombardment yet conducted on the Western Front, an effort that would involve virtually every gun that could be brought to bear on the target area. For days before the attack, ammunition trucks rolled forward in endless convoys, stacking shells in dumps that stretched for acres behind the American lines. German reconnaissance spotted this buildup and reported it to headquarters, but the response remained dismissive. Experienced officers assured their subordinates that Americans always assembled impressive amounts of material, but lacked the staying power to use it effectively, that the bombardment would be intense but brief, survivable for troops in properly prepared positions. On the morning of November 16th, the American bombardment began, And within the first hour, German commanders realized that something fundamentally different was happening. The shelling did not follow the pattern of previous attacks, building to a crescendo and then lifting to allow infantry to advance. Instead, it continued with unrelenting intensity, guns firing so rapidly that individual explosions merged into a continuous roar that could be heard dozens of miles away. Forward positions simply disintegrated under the weight of fire. Bunkers that had been built to withstand direct hits collapsed as shell after shell struck the same locations, and the landscape itself began to change, as trees were splintered into kindling, and the earth was churned into a moonscape of overlapping craters. German troops who survived in deep bunkers found themselves trapped because the communication trenches and supply routes that connected them to rear areas had been obliterated. Officers attempting to coordinate defensive responses discovered that their phone lines had been cut by the bombardment, and that radio communications were nearly impossible due to the electromagnetic interference created by thousands of shells exploding simultaneously. The mockery and confidence that had characterized German attitudes toward American firepower evaporated as the bombardment continued into its second hour, then its third, showing no signs of slackening. Soldiers who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts began to break psychologically under the relentless pounding, and reports reaching German headquarters spoke not of tactical challenges to overcome, but of complete disintegration of defensive positions under fire that exceeded anything in their experience. The most shocking manifestation of American artillery power came not in urban areas where the destruction of buildings was expected, but in the forested regions where ancient woodlands were literally erased from the landscape by sustained bombardments. The Huichen forest, which had seemed like an impenetrable green fortress, began to look like something from an alien planet as American guns turned their attention to specific sectors. When German resistance proved particularly stubborn in a given area, American commanders would designate that area for what they called saturation bombardment, a procedure that involved calculating the exact number of shells required to ensure that every square meter of ground received multiple high explosive impacts. The resulting fire missions consumed thousands of shells and continued for hours without pause. Trees that had stood for over a century were snapped like matchsticks, their trunks shattered by the concussion of nearby explosions even when not directly hit. The forest canopy that had protected German positions from air attack and observation became a liability as shells detonated among the branches, creating massive airburst effects that showered shrapnel downward in deadly curtains. After bombardments that lasted half a day or more, reconnaissance flights revealed landscapes that looked as if they had been clear-cut by invisible loggers, with entire square kilometers of forest reduced to splintered stumps and scattered branches. German soldiers who survived in the deepest bunkers emerged to find their world transformed into something unrecognizable, all landmarks obliterated, navigation made impossible by the complete destruction of terrain features they had used to orient themselves. The psychological impact of witnessing such total transformation of the landscape was profound, because it demonstrated that there was literally nowhere to hide from American firepower if they decided to apply it with sufficient intensity. Defensive positions that had been carefully sited to take advantage of terrain features found those features simply removed from existence, leaving defenders exposed in a barren wasteland where nothing remained standing. German officers who had dismissed American artillery as unsophisticated now found themselves writing after-action reports that struggled to convey the scale of destruction to commanders who had not witnessed it personally. They described entire forests vanishing, landscapes becoming unrecognizable, and defensive positions not just damaged or suppressed, but completely obliterated down to the subsoil. The cumulative effect of these massive bombardments went beyond the physical destruction. They caused to fundamentally undermine the entire German defensive philosophy that had been developed over years of warfare. German doctrine assumed that defenders in prepared positions enjoyed significant advantages over attackers, that fortifications and terrain could multiply the effectiveness of outnumbered troops, allowing them to hold against superior forces. This calculation depended on the assumption that attackers had limited resources and would eventually exhaust themselves against determined resistance. American artillery doctrine shattered these assumptions by demonstrating that prepared positions could be neutralized through the application of overwhelming firepower regardless of how well designed or skillfully defended they might be. German commanders found themselves trapped in an impossible dilemma, where concentrating forces to hold key positions merely created lucrative targets for American artillery, while dispersing forces to reduce vulnerability meant they lacked the strength to hold anywhere. The speed with which American forces could mass fires on targets meant that German reinforcements moving to threatened sectors were often caught in the open and decimated before they could reach their positions. Counter-battery fire, the traditional artillery response to enemy bombardments, proved largely ineffective because American guns vastly outnumbered German artillery, and because American counter-battery radar could locate German guns within seconds of them firing and bring overwhelming return fire before they could displace. German artillery units found themselves unable to provide effective fire support to their infantry, because any gun position that revealed itself by firing would be targeted by dozens of American guns within minutes, forcing German gunners to choose between supporting their infantry or preserving their guns. The logistical sustainability of American fire operations proved equally demoralizing, because German intelligence kept predicting that American ammunition supplies would run low, that the massive expenditures could not be maintained. But the bombardments continued day after day without any sign of slackening. Interrogations of American prisoners revealed that artillery units were sometimes firing more shells in a single day than German divisions received in a month, numbers that seemed so impossible that German intelligence officers initially dismissed them as disinformation before photographic evidence confirmed the staggering scale of American supply operations. The personal accounts of German soldiers who survived these bombardments provide the most vivid testimony to the psychological impact of experiencing firepower on this scale. Diaries and letters captured by Allied forces or recovered after the war contained descriptions that read almost like horror fiction rather than military reports. Soldiers described hours spent in bunkers with explosions so continuous that individual blasts could not be distinguished, creating instead a constant vibration that made it difficult to breathe and caused bleeding from ears and noses. They wrote about emerging from shelter to find that men in nearby positions had simply vanished, with no trace remaining except perhaps fragments of equipment scattered across cratered ground. The noise itself was described as beyond anything they had experienced, a physical force that seemed to compress the chest and make thought impossible. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Soviet artillery barrages in Stalingrad, wrote that nothing in their previous experience compared to American bombardments, that the Russians had more guns but the Americans had limitless ammunition and the systematic determination to use it without regard for expense. Some accounts describe soldiers going mad during extended bombardments, screaming or catatonic, their minds simply unable to process the sustained horror of being unable to fight back or escape, only endure. Others wrote about the eerie silence after bombardments ended, how ears would ring for hours or days afterward, and how the absence of explosion became almost as disturbing as their presence because it meant that infantry attacks would soon follow. The survivors also noted how the character of German resistance began to change as units that endured these bombardments lost their fighting spirit. Men who had been reliable soldiers began seeking ways to surrender or desert, calculating that any fate was preferable to enduring another bombardment. Unit cohesion degraded as survivors lost faith in their officers' ability to protect them, and began making individual decisions about when to fight and when to flee. The arrogance that had characterized German military attitudes in the early stages of the war gave way to a desperate fatalism, a sense that they were facing an enemy that could not be defeated through superior tactics or fighting spirit, but only through somehow surviving until the war ended. The devastating effectiveness of American artillery bombardments was not simply the result of superior resources, but represented the culmination of doctrinal development that had been ongoing throughout the war. American artillery doctrine emphasized centralized control and massed fires, allowing commanders to concentrate overwhelming force at critical points rather than distributing guns evenly along the front. This required sophisticated communications and fire control systems that American forces had been perfecting since North Africa, learning from early failures and continuously refining their procedures. The Field Artillery School at Fort Sill had produced thousands of officers trained in standardized fire control methods, creating a common language and set of procedures that allowed units from different divisions to coordinate seamlessly. Forward observer training emphasized aggressive positioning and rapid communication, with observers expected to move with lead infantry elements and call fires with precision, even under direct fire. The time required to execute fire missions was compressed through constant practice and the elimination of unnecessary steps from the fire control process, allowing American batteries to respond to calls for fire in minutes where other armies might require 15 or 20 minutes. Fire direction centers evolved into highly efficient processing units, where teams of calculators and plotters could manage simultaneous fire missions for multiple batteries, shifting fires rapidly as the tactical situation developed. The development of proximity fuses, which caused shells to detonate at optimal height above the ground without requiring precise fuse settings, dramatically increased the lethality of artillery fire against personnel and made saturation bombardments even more devastating. American artillery also benefited from close integration with other arms, with air observers and fighter bombers working in coordination with guns to identify and strike targets, and with infantry and armor commanders trained to think in terms of combined arms operations, where artillery was always a primary consideration rather than an afterthought. This systematic approach to artillery warfare represented a uniquely American way of fighting that emphasized system efficiency and overwhelming application of resources rather than individual heroism or tactical brilliance, and it proved brutally effective against an enemy that was being progressively ground down by material and manpower shortages. The dominance that American artillery achieved over German forces by late 1944 and early 1945 had strategic consequences that extended far beyond the tactical results of individual bombardments. German commanders found themselves unable to mount effective counterattacks or hold prepared defensive lines because American forces could break up any concentration of troops with devastating fire. This loss of tactical flexibility meant that German strategy devolved into passive defense and desperate attempts to delay the inevitable Allied advance rather than any realistic hope of achieving military victory. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Germany's last major offensive in the West, demonstrated both the desperation of German strategy and the decisive impact of American artillery when weather cleared enough to allow full deployment of firepower. The initial German attacks achieved surprise and made significant gains while fog and snow limited American air and artillery operations. But once clear weather allowed American forces to bring their full firepower to bear, the offensive collapsed with devastating speed. German armored columns were caught in the open and destroyed by artillery fire so intense that survivors described roads choked with burning vehicles and bodies. The reduction of the Bulge salient was accomplished primarily through artillery fire rather than maneuver, with American guns systematically demolishing German positions and interdicting supply routes until the entire offensive collapsed. In the final campaigns of the war, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and drove into Germany, the pattern repeated with wearisome predictability from the German perspective. Any city or town that chose to resist was subjected to bombardments that reduced it to rubble, persuading many German commanders that surrender was preferable to defending positions that would simply be erased by American firepower. The crossing of the Rhine itself was preceded by bombardments that exceeded even the massive fire preparations earlier in the war, with some sectors receiving over 65,000 shells in the preparatory phase alone. German defenders who survived spoke of the earth itself seeming to shake continuously, of bunkers collapsing even when not directly hit, and of landscapes so completely transformed that navigation became impossible. Understanding how American forces achieved such overwhelming artillery superiority requires examining the technological and industrial factors that undergirded the tactical operations. American gun design emphasized reliability and ease of manufacture over theoretical sophistication, creating weapons like the M2-105 howitzer that were not particularly advanced compared to German designs, but were supremely practical and could be produced in vast quantities. The standardization of ammunition across different gun types simplified supply logistics and reduced the likelihood of errors in combat. American metallurgy and manufacturing quality meant that guns could sustain high rates of fire without excessive wear or mechanical failure, while German guns of equivalent or superior design often suffered reliability problems due to wartime degradation of manufacturing standards. The development of efficient artillery tractors and prime movers meant that American guns could be repositioned rapidly, making counter-battery fire less effective and allowing artillery units to keep pace with advancing infantry and armor. Perhaps most importantly, American investment in ammunition production had created a supply system of staggering scale. Plants across the United States were producing artillery shells 24 hours a day, with production rates measured in millions of rounds per month. The shells themselves were manufactured to exacting standards that ensured reliability and consistent performance, reducing dud rates and making fire planning more predictable. The logistics infrastructure required to move these shells from American factories to front-line units in Europe represented an organizational achievement at least as impressive as the tactical employment of the guns themselves. Liberty ships carried ammunition across the Atlantic in dedicated cargoes. Ports in Britain and France handled the massive volumes of material with specialized equipment and procedures. And the Red Ball Express and other truck networks moved supplies forward with remarkable efficiency. Supply officers developed sophisticated inventory systems that tracked ammunition expenditures and ensured that units received resupply before they exhausted their stocks, maintaining a constant pressure that German forces found impossible to counter. The devastating effectiveness of American artillery raised questions about the human cost of this approach to warfare, and whether there were moral dimensions to the industrial-scale destruction that characterized these campaigns. From one perspective, the massive use of artillery saved American lives by reducing the need for costly infantry assaults against prepared positions, allowing firepower to do what would otherwise require frontal attacks by riflemen. Casualty statistics supported this view, showing that American infantry divisions that had strong artillery support suffered significantly lower casualties than those that attempted to advance without adequate fire support. The destruction of enemy forces through bombardment before they could effectively engage American troops seemed like a rational and humane way to wage war compared to the alternative of close-quarters infantry combat. Yet the scale of destruction and the effects on both enemy combatants and civilian populations in the battle zones raised troubling questions. The bombardments that erased forests and towns from the landscape killed not only soldiers, but also civilians who were caught in the target areas. and the distinction between military and civilian targets became blurred when entire towns were designated for destruction because they contained German defensive positions. The psychological effects on German soldiers who survived these bombardments, many of whom suffered from what would today be recognized as severe PTSD, represented a form of injury that was not always counted in casualty statistics, but was nonetheless profound. There were also questions about whether the massive expenditure of resources on artillery represented an optimal use of American industrial capacity, whether the same resources devoted to other purposes might have shortened the war by different means. Some historians have argued that American reliance on firepower reflected a casualty-averse approach that actually prolonged the war by allowing German forces to retreat and regroup, rather than being encircled and destroyed through more aggressive maneuver. Though this critique ignores the very real political constraints under which American commanders operated, and the responsibility they felt to preserve the lives of their soldiers. In the aftermath of the war, German officers who survived wrote extensively about their experiences and attempted to analyze where their pre-war theories and wartime practices had gone wrong. The dismissive attitude toward American military capabilities emerged as a recurring theme in these post-war analyses, with many officers acknowledging that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American power. They had confused lack of military tradition with lack of military capability, failing to recognize that American strengths lay not in the individual courage or tactical skill of soldiers, but in the systematic application of organizational and industrial resources to military problems. The overwhelming artillery fire that had destroyed German defensive positions was seen in retrospect as the inevitable result of American industrial capacity being brought fully to bear on the war effort, something that German intelligence had noted, but German commanders had failed to take seriously enough in their planning. Some former officers argued that Germany's military leadership had been too influenced by their successful campaigns against European opponents, and had failed to appreciate that the United States represented a fundamentally different type of enemy, one whose strengths lay in areas where European military tradition had little experience. The cultural tendency to see warfare as an art requiring genius and improvisation had blinded German officers to the effectiveness of the American approach that treated warfare as an engineering problem requiring systematic solutions. Others noted that German strategic position by 1944 was so hopeless that no tactical adjustments could have compensated for the overwhelming material superiority the Allies had achieved, that the question was not whether Germany would lose but only how long defeat could be delayed. The artillery bombardments that had seemed so devastating were merely one manifestation of a larger reality that Germany was fighting enemies with vastly greater resources, who were determined to use those resources without restraint to achieve victory. The demonstration of American artillery power in the final year of World War II had lasting effects on military doctrine that extended well beyond the immediate post-war period. The U.S. Army institutionalized the lessons learned in Europe, making artillery a centerpiece of its tactical doctrine for decades to come. The concept of massed fires and centralized control that had proven so effective became standard practice, taught to generations of artillery officers, and integrated into planning for potential conflicts in Europe during the Cold War. The NATO alliance adopted similar doctrines, with Allied armies learning American methods and integrating them with their own traditions. The Soviet Union, which had its own tradition of massive artillery employment, studied American methods and incorporated some elements into their own evolving doctrine, though they maintained their characteristic preference for even larger numbers of guns firing shorter bombardments, rather than the American approach of fewer guns firing sustained missions. The technological developments that had supported American artillery superiority, particularly in fire control and communications, became the foundation for further advances that would eventually lead to modern precision artillery systems. The integration of computers into fire direction centers in the 1960s and later was a direct evolution from the manual calculation systems that had been perfected during World War II. The development of smart munitions and GPS-guided shells represented a continuation of the American preference for technological solutions to military problems, allowing even greater effectiveness with fewer guns and less ammunition. Yet the basic principle that had shocked German officers in 1944 remained constant: that properly coordinated artillery fire could achieve effects out of proportion to the size of the force delivering it, that firepower could substitute for manpower, and that an enemy's will to resist could be broken through the systematic application of overwhelming destructive force. The physical scars left by the massive bombardments of 1944 and 1945 persisted for decades after the war ended, serving as permanent reminders of the destructive power that had been unleashed. Forests that had been reduced to splintered stumps slowly regenerated, but the new growth was different in character: secondary forest rather than the ancient woodlands that had existed before. The cratered landscapes left by artillery fire were gradually smoothed over and reclaimed by vegetation, but aerial photography could still detect the patterns of shell impacts decades later. In some areas, unexploded ordnance from the bombardments continued to pose hazards into the 21st century, with farmers and construction workers occasionally discovering shells that had failed to detonate during the war. Towns that had been obliterated by American artillery were often rebuilt in different styles, creating a stark contrast between surviving medieval architecture and the modern reconstruction, permanent evidence of the moment when entire communities had been erased from existence. The human memory of these events proved equally persistent, with German veterans of the Western Front carrying their experiences to their graves and passing stories to children and grandchildren. The bombardments became a defining trauma for an entire generation, comparable in some ways to the horror of the Eastern Front, but different in character, because the destruction came not from the chaos of close combat, but from an impersonal, systematic application of industrial firepower that rendered individual courage or skill meaningless. Historians who interviewed survivors decades after the war found that memories of the bombardments remained vivid and emotionally charged, with elderly men still able to describe in precise detail the sound and sensation of being subjected to American artillery fire. These personal testimonies became important historical sources because official records often failed to capture the experiential reality of what these bombardments were like for those who endured them. When we look back at this story of how German mockery gave way to terror, as American artillery demonstrated its devastating power, we must understand it as more than simply a tale of military technology or tactical doctrine. This was a moment when the nature of warfare itself was being transformed by the complete mobilization of industrial economies for military purposes. The German officers who stood in their command posts in 1944 and dismissed American capabilities were not simply wrong in their assessment, but were witnessing the end of an era in which warfare could be understood primarily in terms of tactics, training, and fighting spirit. They represented a military tradition that stretched back centuries, one that valued the art of war and saw combat as a test of national character and military genius. What they faced in American artillery was something fundamentally new, a way of making war that treated human conflict as an engineering problem to be solved through the systematic application of overwhelming resources. The forests that vanished under American bombardments were not just tactical objectives being cleared, but symbols of the old order being swept away by industrial modernity. The German experience of American firepower in the final year of World War II demonstrated with brutal clarity that no amount of tactical skill or defensive preparation could overcome the fundamental disadvantage of facing an enemy with vastly superior resources, who was willing to use those resources without restraint. This lesson had implications that extended far beyond the immediate military situation in Europe in 1944, foreshadowing how future conflicts would be shaped by industrial capacity and technological superiority rather than traditional military virtues. The mockery with which German officers initially greeted American artillery preparations revealed not just a failure of intelligence assessment, but a deeper failure to understand how warfare was evolving in the age of total industrial mobilization. The thunder that rolled across the Western Front in those final months of the war represented more than the sound of shells exploding. It was the sound of one era giving way to another, of old certainties being shattered as comprehensively as the forests and towns that disappeared under the bombardments. The story of German officers learning to fear American artillery is ultimately a story about the transformation of warfare itself, about the moment when the Industrial Revolution's full impact on human conflict became undeniably clear. It is a story that reminds us that in war, as in all human endeavors, assumptions about the superiority of tradition and experience can be swept away with shocking speed when they encounter the relentless logic of industrial and technological progress, applied without reservation or restraint. The landscapes that were transformed and the lives that were shattered in those months of bombardment stand as testament to both the terrible effectiveness of modern firepower and the human cost of the conflicts that shaped the 20th century. The forests may have regenerated and the cratered earth been smoothed over, but the lessons learned in those moments when German mockery turned to terror remain relevant, wherever military forces contemplate the nature of modern warfare and the role that overwhelming firepower plays in shaping the outcome of human conflicts.